National News Now.
All right, so last week, President Trump traveled to Davos, Switzerland to participate in the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum. Now, this annual conference hosts world political leaders, business leaders, journalists, and celebrities for a series of meetings designed to assess the state of global political and economic affairs while pursuing the broad goals of peace, prosperity, and security. Now, Trump's participation and speech was significant because he and his administration have repeatedly criticized the globalist policies associated with this community. Now, these policies include the reduction or elimination of barriers that limit international trade and support for multilateral cooperation or multilateralism through international organizations like the United Nations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. His opposition to globalism is so significant because prior American presidents have been its chief global champions since 1945. The globalization of today that orders the international system and the U.S.'s relationship with other countries around the world, this globalization emerged from active American support and sponsorship since 1945.
Yeah, the current system is the system we built.
Yes, exactly, and which is why this is so historically significant, because Trump is criticizing the system that the United States has created and strengthened over the last 70 years.
And demands that it change.
Yeah.
And so that's what is such a huge break.
So what was Trump's message at Davos? How would it be received by a community that is generally viewed as Trump skeptics? So we're going to watch a quick clip here from PBS to get a summary of these meetings.
He used the occasion to declare the United States is open for business. Special correspondent Ryan Chilcote reports from Davos.
The fanfare of a Swiss marching band heralded the president's address to the global leaders and his sales pitch for America.
There has never been a better time to hire, to build, to invest, and to grow in the United States. America is open for business, and we are competitive once again.
Mr. Trump touted his tax cuts and regulatory overhaul.
We are freeing our businesses and workers so they can thrive and flourish as never before.
The president also sought to reassure his audience that his America First agenda is not bad for the rest of the world. But he said free trade must be fair.
The United States will no longer turn a blind eye to unfair economic practices, including massive intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies, and pervasive state-led economic planning.
The remarks appeared to encourage many business leaders at the forum.
Very well represented the American policies that he's put into place.
Others pushed back on President Trump's claim of economic achievements.
Stocks hitting records means more wealth for the few at the top, but makes no difference at all for people at the bottom.
There were also boos and hisses when the president branded the news media nasty, mean, and vicious. The hall was so packed I shared my chair with a Nobel Prize-winning economist. A Japanese politician sat beside him. Both my neighbors were dumbstruck by the spectacular start to the event, even though they got little of the provocative Trump. The president was restrained, on message.
All right, so let me highlight a few things from this clip and his speech. First, this was a speech like one at a sales conference. America is open for business. Everybody should be investing here. Why? He gives two primary reasons, and this is largely what Republicans have touted over the last couple of months. First, the Republican administration, with support from Congress, is cutting regulations or administrative hurdles that raise the costs of doing business inside the United States. So what might be some examples of these regulations that the Trump administration is saying that it's eliminating? We'll talk about that more in a little bit. First, you might think about the need to get construction permits when you build a house, when you build roads. These are regulations that set the rules under which you can hire and under which you can start, digging new wells and laying concrete and the like. You think about worker safety rules from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, along these lines. Limits on carbon emissions from coal-burning electricity plants that make it harder for them to remain working. These are the types of regulations that the Trump administration wants to eliminate or reduce. Now, I read a little bit on this last night, and it's really hard to assess the progress of the administration here. Some of the eliminated regulations are tied up in the courts now, and so they're still in place. Some of these regulations were Obama-era rules that had never come into play. So yes, they've been eliminated, but they never came into effect in this administration. It is clear, though, that there hasn't been a new growth or new creation of these regulations in this administration. And so if you look at the history of administrations and how many new administrative rules that administrations create, and there's this steady growth, and that growth has stopped in the first year of the Trump administration. And so it's unclear how many regulations the Trump administration has eliminated, but it's clear there hasn't been new growth in the regulatory hurdles associated with doing business in the United States.
One thing to note is the difference between reality and perception. And perception matters, right? And if there is a broad perception that there are regulations that are getting swept away by this Trump administration that doesn't like regulations. And so business adapts to that, the stock market rises partly because of the perception and expectation that is happening.
It's hard to find a story that says, all right, these 10 regulations were eliminated and they have helped fuel economic growth in these ways.
Right.
It's just
at this percent or anything like that. Don't ever buy that.
And at this stage, so the other thing that was really emphasized in the speech, and we want to talk about a little bit more, is the corporate tax cut that was passed last December. So you guys have probably heard about the big tax overhaul that occurred. Corporate taxes were reduced from 35% to 21%. And let's give you some sense of the significance of this. So imagine that a company makes $10 billion annually in profits. Last year, they paid the government $3.5 billion in taxes, or 35% of that $10 billion profit. This year, they will pay the government $2.1 billion. In this case, the corporation gets to keep $1.4 billion. This is a massive redistribution of wealth from the government to the corporate sector, and this has had a huge effect on the stock market. Now, the stock market, when I was walking in today, I see that it's down about 300 and 350 points, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average is up about 46% or 47% since Trump was elected back in November of 2016, from about 17,900 to 26.1 or 26.2 this morning, the last time I checked. Why this huge run up in the stock market that everyone is excited about now? I shouldn't say everyone. Corporate America, Republicans are very excited about it. People that are worried about the long-run deficit implications of this aren't as excited about it.
People worried about income inequality aren't excited about it either.
At all, yes.
Right?
So why is the stock market exploding, and what does this have to do with the tax cut? Stock market prices have been pushed upward throughout 2017, even before the tax cuts were signed into law in December of 2017. But stock prices went up by expectations. They were fueled by expectations of the tax cut and then its legalization. Now, this tax cut, so what was happening was business leaders, stock market managers, portfolio managers, hedge funds were betting that Congress and the president could get a tax cut signed in place that would have huge corporate tax cuts. So they were betting that it would occur, and in anticipation that this would occur, that companies would pay less money, less of their profits to the government in taxes, there would be more money left over for shareholders to pay back in dividends or for investment. What all these investors did is anticipate that tax cut and then started to bid up stock prices accordingly. So this tax cut has effectively redistributed capital from the government to large corporations, which then fueled or propelled stock prices upward. Now, also important to note is that this corporate tax cut is encouraging companies to bring capital that's sitting home or sitting abroad in overseas bank accounts back to the United States. President Trump has made a big deal about an announcement last week or the week before from Apple to bring capital from abroad back to the United States. Apple has something, anybody know the numbers? I want to say 150, 175 billion, or maybe it's even over $200 billion. I can't. We'll have somebody fact check this for us. Apple has at least $100 billion, sitting overseas in foreign banks' accounts, and the money is sitting over there because they don't want to pay taxes to the US government. So by keeping it in overseas bank accounts, but keeping it on Apple's books, that helps to push Apple's stock price upwards without having to pay taxes to the US government.
They park it in these other countries because their corporate tax rates were lower than the United States.
And so by pushing corporate taxes down in the United States, what that is encouraging American corporations to do is to bring that capital back home into the American economy, potentially give it back to their shareholders, which pushes stock prices up, or invest in the company, which could also make new investments that could also help push share prices up in the long run. Now, some companies, to be fair, have made direct payments to in the form of bonuses to their workers. AT&T was a good example of this. Let me just say, check the math out on this before you give too much support to these corporations. And so in the case of AT&T, 200,000 workers got a bonus of $1,000.
Yes.
That is a small portion of the amount of tax savings that AT&T will enjoy over the life of this tax cut. And the other thing to keep in mind about this, and we're talking about in percentage terms and the amount of savings over the next decade, the amount of money returned to workers, say in the AT&T cases, it's less than 5% of that corporate tax cut.
Walmart had a similar announcement, but at the very same time, they closed a bunch of Sam's Club stores and eliminated a bunch of jobs. And so, I mean, corporations are going to make money and improve their profits, but they also are, I mean, it's a good investment for them to give more money to their employees, and so there was a certain logic to this. It's essentially this whole idea of trickle down, right? The
other thing that's interesting about this is the messaging surrounded these worker bonuses. They're coordinated with the administration, and the corporations are intentionally giving President Trump a win. They're saying, thanks for that corporate tax cut. See, we're giving money back to the workers. And then
it's working.
Yeah, then President Trump can say, all right, these corporate tax cuts, the new tax bill is rewarding American workers. Once again, the proof is in the pudding. Make sure you check the numbers. In the case of these are small proportions of what the corporations are actually getting. And the other thing to keep in mind that's significant about this corporate tax cut is how was it paid for? It was paid for by raising taxes on other people, right? You're transferring, there was a tax cut for lower income Americans, middle and upper middle Americans will pay a little bit more. The other thing that's significant though about this is the corporate tax cut was permanent. The tax cuts that the rest of American citizens enjoyed, there's a shelf life to these things of about, I can't remember if it's 8 or 10 years.
Right. They're scheduled right now to phase out. Now, some Republicans are arguing, well, we'll just make them permanent later.
Yeah,
but
they couldn't make them permanent now because they would have exploded the deficit. All right, so now let's bring us back to the Davos speech. America's open for business, come invest in the United States. The other thing that this speech did is it reiterated and was focused on America first principles. In economic terms, this has meant a rejection of the standard globalization paradigm. So President Trump talks about we want fair trade, not free trade. Now, what does this mean in practice? It means that the Trump administration wants to move away from multilateral trade deals, such as within the World Trade Organization and the multilateral trading system, and instead wants to move to bilateral trade agreements with other countries. The United States talks about, or the Trump administration talks about, cutting or eliminating bilateral trade deficits with other countries. He criticizes the prior, or what we might call the prior era of globalization, as resulting in unfair trading practices like intellectual property theft, industrial subsidies, and state-led economic planning that gave corporations and businesses from around the world, non-American corporation and businesses, an unfair advantage and access to the American market that wasn't reciprocated when American companies tried to invest around the world. Now, these last set of critiques about unfair trading practices and the need to move to bilateral trade agreements, these are critiques that are clearly aimed at China. He also tries to talk about here that make the case that America first won't necessarily hurt other countries, right? If the United States is open for business, we've got this big corporate tax cut. If you come and invest in the United States, you're going to make more money. So let's talk a little bit more about trade here and this emphasis on the movement to bilateral trade deals rather than multilateral. And this is important with respect to the issue of means in grand strategy. How does the Trump administration interact with other countries? And there's this focus on bilateral rather than multilateral international organizations is important because it's designed to create more bargaining leverage for the United States in these negotiations. If you're working in a bilateral forum, you're typically going to be working with smaller countries, both with respect to the economic size and military power. Therefore, it's easier for the United States to have an advantage in these bargaining situations because it's easier for it to walk away from a bilateral deal. If the United States, say, gets shut out of access to a Central American economy, you just find a substitute, say, in East Asia. Alternatively, for a small Central American economy, if they get shut out of the American consumer market, that's a big risk, a big cost, because it's much harder to replace the size of the American economy with an alternative market around the world. The last thing I want to say about this forum and how Trump's speech was greeted, notice the PBS story talked about him staying on message, wasn't as controversial. What happened there reflects a broader trend, I think, within the United States as well and within the Republican Party over the last couple of years. All of a sudden, American and global business leaders, corporate leaders in the United States have become much more forgiving of President Trump than they were 5 or 6 months ago because of the big corporate tax cut and because of what's happening on Wall Street. A good example of this is the CEO from Goldman Sachs, Blankfein. Did I get that right? That's right. He was sharply critical of Trump's response to Charlottesville back in the fall. He went out on a limb, or I shouldn't say he went on a limb, but this raised a lot of controversy, and it was looked at for people who disagreed with President Trump and Trump skeptics. They looked at the sharp criticism of Trump's response to Charlottesville that was coming from traditional Republican leaders in the business community as a sign of this potentially a division within the Republican Party. Well, many of those business leaders that are associated with the Republican Party have, in a sense, backed away from some of that criticism that we saw 5 or 6 months ago, and have been very complimentary of the Trump administration and its economic policies in the last couple of months. We see this from Goldman Sachs, but we saw this from other global business leaders at Davos as well.
Right, and so they're kind of compartmentalizing. I mean, Charlottesville was about race, and there's going to still be some sharp criticism on those issues, but then they're also going to say, but on this economic side with the corporate tax cut, the Trump policy was right? I mean, a lot of these business leaders feel that not only is it good for their business, but it does bring that capital back to the United States, just as Trump said it would, and it can trickle down and the like. And so there's going to be these competing arguments depending on the issue.
Well, and the other thing to keep in mind about here is that this kind of mainstream or traditional Republicans, they're now going to make a bet. Or what it looks like is they now might make a bet that, yes, we're going to have midterm losses in November, but let's hang with the president now. And we're more bringing this up in the sense that there has been a shift, I think, within establishment Republicans over the last 2 or 3 months on President Trump because of the tax cut that was passed in December.
I mean, they liked it.
Yeah.
And it's going to be, it's only going to take one tweet to turn it around again. But yeah, there has been a definite shift.